Welcome back to the Winsidr Show. Excited for part two of our chat with Alfred discussing international prospects leading up to the 2026 WNBA draft. Fingers crossed we have one. And that could be a whole nother episode diving into what happens if we don't actually have a draft. But last episode, we discussed players who, in your opinion, in the wide range of discussions going around the draft, are more expected to be the main overseas international players' names. We're talking about Awa, Nell, Martin, and Frida. Shameless plug. We're not going to talk too much about them now. You should listen to the other episode. Definitely educated myself a lot, learned a lot in that one. Before we get into today's show, just a quick reminder. Winsidr is a fully independent WNBA outlet, and everything we do is supported by listeners like you. If you enjoy what we do here, you can help keep it going by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/Winsidr. That's patreon.com/Winsidr. With pricing levels for everyone, you're directly supporting the work we put into covering the W year-round. We've also got a full team producing great written coverage over at winsidr.com, plus more content than ever across TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're in the market for WNBA gear, check the affiliate links in the show notes and on winsidr.com. You get to rep the league, and Winsidr gets a little support along the way. Excited to have you back. Alfred, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks again for having me on the pod for, this part. And I'm very excited to get into these players because these are going to be some names that some fans may not be too privy on. So I think, this is the fun part of international draft scouting. It's, you're scouring the globe for hidden gems or, players that you think could be something in the future. So I'm very excited to get into this.
I think it's you said it perfectly. There's some hidden gems. There's the obvious players that everyone knows, has their eyes on. We're going to be discussing more so in this episode, players in your words that are a little bit more of maybe draft and stash, maybe players who are going to go late in the draft, maybe go undrafted, maybe if they're lucky, get a training camp invite, but also something that we touched on before getting on air, like the league's only expanding. We're so used to saying 144. Now we're up to 156. And that's just going to continue to grow year after year after year as we add in more and more teams. And I'm not going to get into diluting the product on the court and things like that. But what I will say is, there's only 100 top 100 American players. There's only 100 top 100 international players. So as these rosters start to maybe expand, as we see, more roster spots, there's going to be more and more overseas players that aren't just the big names, in the same sense of, WNBA fans have grown accustomed to maybe a Veronica Burton, a player who wasn't necessarily the biggest name coming out of college, but finds a way. I'm not trying to throw shade or anything, but finds a way to, solidify their spot on a roster and in this league. And I think there is a wide variety of players overseas that maybe aren't going to go in the first round, aren't going to be a number one and number two, a lottery pick, but still can produce, still can provide a lot to teams, whether it's this year or whether it's a little bit down the road. So do you want to kind of start with our first person, and then we can kind of start going down the list and chatting back and forth?
Sure. So the first name that I want to bring up is Inez Pitoche-Grenelle. So if you're not familiar with Inez Pitoche-Grenelle, she currently plays for the French team Tango Bourges Basket. So if you watch EuroLeague, then you've obviously seen Bourges. It's a team that has multiple players, notable names. Monika Koa-Makani joined the team this season. You also have some quality overseas players like Tima Pouillet. It was also the team that Alicia Toinabise was part of before she decided to come over stateside and join South Carolina. So this is a French team that's very prominent overseas. Now, Inez definitely has a lower role on the team. She, comes off the bench, is typically that do-it-all little wing that you need for some type of effort. Now, when you take a look at her numbers, they definitely don't scream like, okay, this should be a WNBA draft pick. You look at the French league numbers, only averaging about 4 points, 2 rebounds. around 40% from three on 10 attempts. EuroLeague, that actually is higher, around 6 points, 3 rebounds. But if you look at how she plays, one, she actually has very good athleticism for a size at that 5'11", 6-foot build. But she also is a very great offensive rebounder. I think if you watch her games, her hustle, her motor, that is something that I don't think you can teach. And for a player that has that, it's really about refining the other parts of her game. Finishing around the rim definitely needs a lot of work because that's an area that sometimes it looks great, and especially looks great at that EuroLeague level. Sometimes that you can see like there's things that need to be developed. But again, she's only 19. But I think, for a player like that, when you're able to get minutes at the highest level overseas, when you're thinking about a quality French club, but also a EuroLeague club, that means she's playing against W caliber town where you can be playing against Fenerbahce, you can be playing against Basket Land, EuroLeague, or at the domestic level, you can be playing against the Valencias of the world. She's able to get high quality minutes against high quality players. Now, is she a little raw? If you want to think of her in the traditional sense, yes. But I think the good thing about a lot of these draft and stash concept is why not take a chance at a player that's already getting high quality pro minutes against the world's best and let them develop for 2, 3, 4 years and see what you can get. Because if you let a 19-year-old player or 20-year-old player develop for a year or two, when you're getting them, and let's say they've gotten those years of pro play, you're getting basically what you would want from like a 22-year-old domestic draft player that's, has those years of experience and is probably more ready now to be in your rotation as a WNBA team. Now, in terms of player comps, I think she's more of the like scrappy hustle wing. Someone that she actually reminds me a little of just on that end. I'm not saying like completely, but she reminds me a little of Dejanay Carrington in terms of just, that drive for her size at that 5'11" spot. But the reason why I bring up Inez Pitosh-Grenell is she has the athletic tools, she has the motor, she has skills that, it's really like just the finishing and shooting that can be worked on over time. And one player that I actually want to bring up, and I'm not saying Inez Pitosh-Grenell is going to develop into this player because this player was bigger and had a little bit more going for her. But when you look at a Janelle Salon, for example, for Golden State, Janelle Salon, if you really focused on the international scene, you would have known Janelle Salon definitely was a high quality prospect and someone that can play at the W level and was a key part of the French national team. But if you look at where she was actually back in 2021 when she would have been drafted, she actually was undrafted in that class. And you look at her numbers, only about 3 points per game, 2 rebounds per game. So quite obviously it's palpable that, multiple teams definitely passed on her thinking like, okay, this is not someone who we need right now. But as you can see, Janelle Salon has developed into a player that can really play at the W level. Now, I'm not saying Pitosh-Grenell is going to go into that type of player, but what I'm saying is if you have the ability to just stash a player that's actually getting these pro minutes, why not take a chance and see what they can develop? So that's where I see Inez Pitosh-Grenell in this things.
That's interesting. You were talking about a comparison that wasn't that great. I had a different player comparison. Again, I'm going into this. You're breaking down these players for me. And I'm going into this and I'm like, obviously different position, different size, has a little bit less going for it. But I'm hearing Angel Reese. I'm hearing that ability to get the ball, that just nonstop motor, that thing you can't teach, Now, obviously, Angel Reese, national champion, one of the biggest names in women's basketball right now. I'm not trying to compare it in that sense, but just a player who has obvious aspects of her game they need to grow in, but there's that intangible, that those elements that, you can do whatever you want. You can't train that. You can't teach that. Those are the types of players I feel like do an amazing job rounding out a roster. And you kind of touching on that, and I brought this up before we started, so I know I'm not like surprising you on this. But it kind of popped into my head, a Shyla Heel type player, a player who, the international scene knows her name. The teams with international scouts have their eyes on her. The W draft comes up, a player gets drafted. So often, even with college players, right, where it's much easier for WNBA coaches and scouts to pay attention to them. I mean, I'm not trying to throw any teams under the bus here, but I'm well aware of the fact that some WNBA teams have not invested in full scout teams on the international scale. And even some of them struggle with the college scale. So obviously, look, there's times where you draft somebody, you're aware that they're going to take a little bit more time to develop. You hope that they can kind of make that leap in camp, things like that. And so while we're talking about, these international talents, it pops into my head. Obviously, I don't want to like put you on the spot now. If you want to think of somebody later, you have someone in mind. But like, I'm just curious if there's anybody who kind of pops into your head of an overseas player who was drafted, like a Solange, who needed to do some growth. Or I guess she wasn't drafted, but needed to do some growth. Is there anyone in your mind, or I guess how is Heel doing? Like, how's her game develop? If I remember correctly, she had like an ACL injury or like some really bad injury. Is she in recovery mode right now? Like, I don't know. Fill me in overseas.
Yeah, so Charlotte Heel has been, back in the mix in Australia. And I think right now she's just trying to really get developed back into what, she was prior to those injuries. So right now, I don't think she's, at that level to come over anything, but I think she's still working on her craft overseas right now. But in terms of a name that, I actually have two, and it's ironic because they actually got drafted, I believe, back to back. And it's Leonie Fibic and Luisa Geiselshoder, who were drafted both in that 2020 draft, I think second round picks. But you look at Leonie Fibic, the Fibic that you saw when she was drafted is not necessarily the Fibic that you've seen now. We've seen a Fibic that had to spend multiple years overseas playing for various different clubs in various different countries. She played in France for a little bit. She played in Australia for a little bit. And then, she ended up becoming a force in Spain and became a multi-time Spanish League MVP. You look at someone like Luisa Geiselshoder, she's also had to really develop overseas, and then she got her chance this season to come back, and she's actually shown that she can be a WNBA rotation player. And we're talking about players that were drafted 2020, and really only recently coming over, Leonie coming in 2024, Geiselshoder coming after. So that's the whole point, I think, of drafting stashes. It doesn't necessarily need to be, okay, we're going to bring this player back next year or the following year. Sometimes drafting stashes need time, but I think if you're able to, personnel-wise maintain those rights, why not let them develop overseas and, give them the chance to operate in their own right versus, bringing them over. There have been all those conversations about roster spots. We've seen how training camp can be contentious where, we've seen first-round picks, we've seen second-round picks get cut, and now you lose those rights to a player that you never know in a year or two could have really been something special. So I think that's the main thing with drafting stashes is really letting them develop on their own time and seeing what the chips may have in store.
Also, you might say having that conversation or having understanding or a knowledge of if that player wants to come over, because you can be put in a really tough position. I think back to the Minnesota Lynx of this past year, when Dorka Juhas said, I'm not going to say if it was the team or her, whatever, like end of the day, she sits out this past season. That made the Lynx life a whole heck of a lot easier. Sometimes you're put in a situation where you think you're drafting stashing, right? Or you're hoping you're drafting stashing. But then that player's like, no, I'm ready for the lights. I want to come to the W. They come on over. Maybe they're not ready for it. And you have to cut them from a roster because, we've talked about this way too many times, not you and I, but just W heads in general, that there's not enough roster spots. The cap space isn't enough. And often you want to have a player and cap wise, you just cannot make it work. So yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to keep bothering you about
another
those players.
name
Yeah.
Could bring up, not necessarily a drafting stash since she actually played in the W early on in her career and has taken some years overseas, but Awak Queer, she's been on an impressive run with Galatasaray this season. I think her game has really gone to new heights when you look at just the handling, the shooting, someone that's 6'6", that's just so versatile and mobile. I think, that's really a good case of, sometimes it may not necessarily be right to come over right away. There's still things that you can have to learn that you need to develop at, but, going overseas, which was really a personal decision for her, it's really allowed her to blossom into a very, very intriguing player and arguably one of Europe's top players right now.
And it's really interesting because, like, I remember when Awak was coming into the league, and I remember the hype that I was hearing from agents and people who were zoned in on overseas. And I just found it funny because it was like Awak came through, and then soon after it was Sika, and then soon after it was Dom, and then soon after now it's Awa. And it's really interesting. Now, obviously, all of them have slightly different skill sets. I am majorly simplifying it as bigs who are lanky and stretch the floor and have more abilities than a typical big. I get that. I'm oversimplifying it. But I always found it funny, this like streamline of, hearing this one's going to be that good. She could be a generational talent. Then, oh, you thought that was good? Wait for this next one. She could be generational talent. Then I'm pretty sure she is a generational talent. Then I'm pretty sure she is the next generational talent. Really interesting going through all of these different players. So, all right, back to the list. Sorry, I forced us onto that.
No worries.
Who we got
next? No, this is going to be a 2-hour conversation. But yeah, moving on next. So, is a player that I've been covering for a while, and I've really been interested in her game. And she actually could have made the first episode. The issue is she has not played yet this season. She did play in the WNBA last season. And the player I'm talking about is Saffron Shields. Now, Saffron Shields is, to me, she has the potential to be a 6'2" point guard if everything plays out on level. And that's something that we've really heard of, at a WNBA level. But she is, a phenomenal playmaker at 6'2". She can push the pace in transition. She can attack downhill. She can rebound at a high level and really finds teammates and puts them in quality positions to score. Now, she had a phenomenal showing in the 2024 Asia Cup, especially in the finals, where she played up against China and the 7'5" Zhang Zhiyu. So that's the name that some may be familiar with, looking for ahead of 2027. But, she had a phenomenal showing against that Chinese team, where she had 31 points, 15 rebounds, and 6 assists. Also playing with some notable collegiate names like Lara Samfai and Bonnie Dees, who we've seen now, come over to the collegiate level. She played in the 2025 Nike Hoop Summit, and she also did get some minutes in the WNBL last season with the Townsville Fire, where her performances were a little bit up and down, but she was able to get some rotational minutes. The biggest thing for me is she's been sitting out with an injury right now. She was expected to be back in December, then December got pushed to January, so we're really still waiting to see if she's going to play this season. However, I really think her stock is going to be more incumbent on, does she play or does she not? Because if she doesn't play, you're really relying on film pre-injury and especially last year. However, if we're able to get some film on her this season just to see how she fares a little bit, especially coming off that injury and throwing up against some relatively good WNBL talent this year, I think that's really going to be the biggest difference maker on kind of where Saffron goes. But that's a player I've been high on for quite a while, and I'm intrigued to see if we're able to get her back and if she's able to get drafted this year.
Flat out, that's just a name that needs to be an all-star because I need a jersey with her name on it. But no, talk to me. Is she, what like, is her game pass first? Is her game score first? Is she a 3-point threat? Is she attack the basket? Like what's her game?
So I'd say she's more like a hybrid between a pass first and a really like a slasher kind of player. The shooting was up and down that the WNBL season that she played in, where she could knock down some perimeter shots, knock down a couple threes, but really where she's efficient at is one in transition, especially if she has the advantage. If it's like a 2-on-1, 3-on-2 situation, she's just so adept at finding those plays in transition. Like I tell you, if you look at some of the film, some of it is like those like Showtime. It's just like fancy passes or whatever in transition. Like she has a great ability to process the floor. Now the shooting is something that will have to come in time. But again, at 6'2", that can penetrate, get through the gaps, and find teammates. I think to have that size and court vision, that's really the big thing for Saffron.
All right. Do you have? She sounds like a unicorn. Do you have a W comparison? Because that sounds tough.
I've struggled with that comparison for quite a bit. I think like she has the potential to be a unicorn. If she can stay healthy and she can, recoup some of that development maybe lost with this injury time, I think she can be very interesting. She's special.
I always hope when a young player gets injured that they use that time to still develop their mind of the game, develop how they see the court, and not, just take that time to try and get back into physical shape, because obviously that's going to take time. That you can only do so much PT throughout a day. You can do a lot of film study. You can grow your game in many ways when you're not physically on the court doing certain things. Who we got next on the list?
Great. So we're going back to France for this name. We have Stella Cola, who she plays for Charnay, a 5'10" point guard, similar to Ines Granell, low usage for Charnay. Charnay was the team Monica Makani played for last season before coming into the WNBA. But so far her performances have been pretty decent. She gets around 15 to 20 minutes across the French League and Euro Cup, averages around 4 points, 3 to 4 assists. The shooting is also another thing where it's a work in progress, but she's knocked out some perimeter shots on low volume. She's 40% in the domestic league, but only on 7 to 10 attempts, 38% on roughly 8 to 10 attempts in the Euro Cup level. She played on the U19 World Cup stage last season with France, where we also saw Nella Angloma, who we talked about before. And as Patosh Grenell was also part of that team. Also, some potential names coming up in the future, like Sarah Cisse and Anwar Rissachir, sister of Zachary Rissachir on the NBA side. But with Stella Kolar, she's a very interesting player because she's 5'10". She can see the floor well. She reminds me a little bit of like Iana Martin, not necessarily that high level passer, not necessarily that high level pick and roll player, but you see the flashes in her game where it's like, okay, this is someone clearly that we do need to develop over time. Like if we are gonna use the draft pick on her, let her develop overseas, let her continue to get better and better and see where that pans out. But in terms of a comp, she's definitely a throwback to more of those traditional point guards in the sense of a pass first, is really looking for her teammates, can get to the rim, can drive, can throw an occasional over the head pass, can occasionally find the weak side and that stuff. But yeah, she's definitely going to be a work in progress if she gets selected, but definitely a point guard that's playing at a pro level.
I am getting so nervous for USA basketball's road to repeat, or I don't know what you call it at this point, to continue this through whatever it is, considering how close last Olympics was. The Olympics are coming soon for basketball. It's going to be interesting. Obviously, Winter Olympics coming up any day now. Yeah, everything I'm hearing is, wow, get concerned about this up and coming class in the French. Watch out. Who we got next?
Sure. So we are going to Belgium for our next name. Ella de Klerk, who I think most of W fans have probably never heard of before, but we're talking about a 6'1" forward, played at the U20 Eurobasket level last season, but she was phenomenal there. But she's actually the leading scorer in Belgium's pro league right now at 22 points per game. We're talking about a crafty wing with, an array of counters, a phenomenal spin move. The athleticism for speed is probably not necessarily at a W level yet, but you're talking about a player that just has an instinctual feel for scoring within the 3-point line in terms of, just the counters. It can be a step through, it can be a Euro step, it can be just such an array of footwork that she just processes things at a high level. I think it's really for her, the next development for her is one, shooting, because she's definitely not a 3-point shooter. Most of her work is really within the arc, but really playing against higher level comp. I think that's going to be big for her. Not necessarily like Leonie Fibic, but where Leonie Fibic had to kind of play in other leagues outside of the German league and really find her footing against quality athleticism. I think that's what's going to be next for Ella de Klerk. The Belgian league does have some quality players in their own right. You have some notable names like Kennedy Todd Williams, Javen Nicholson, Quay Miller, Deona Gaston, who play over there. But I think in terms of like a WNBA level player, I would like to see Ella de Klerk play against, more athletic wings because of her size, her position at that 6'1", but just a phenomenal player in terms of the potential that she could be.
And look, you have to be excited if you are supporting or looking at Belgian players, knowing Mike T over there coaching that national team. I think he's still coaching it for this coming year.
Yep.
Because, like, first of all, that is a huge benefit for them, just in terms of him as a coach, him as a GM, but also his understanding of USA basketball, his understanding of what the W is looking for, what coaches and GMs in the W are looking for. So maybe it's wrong. I view it kind of similarly to if I was looking at a UConn player and having that respect for the coach and understanding of what they build and what they have done and what they'll continue to do. So, all right, we got a ton of France and a ton of Belgium. Is this next player also from Europe?
Yes, I mean, it depends on how you classify Europe, but we are actually going to Russia for this next player. We're going to talk about Yulia Savakova. Now, Yulia Savakova is a 5'10" point guard, plays for NBA Moscow. She actually had an early stretch in the Russian Premier League season where she was one of their top scorers, but we're talking about a pick and roll heavy volume guard, can definitely shoot the three, can do a lot of things out of screen actions. she does have some flashes of passing, but there are definitely something she needs to work on. Can be very loose with the ball. Sometimes, forces the issue, really forces the pass, which, allows for a lot of deflections. I think really finishing versus length and athleticism is something that she needs to work on, even though she has shown she can get downhill and penetrate. But similar to Ella de Klerk, I think the big thing for her is really once she's drafted and she's developing, can she find herself in another league where she can really get that feel against, potential W caliber guards? Because right now the Russian league doesn't really have as much comp that you can get from there. But I will say, in terms of maybe comparing her to another recent Russian player that we saw get drafted, Anastasia Kosu, who was drafted to the Lynx last year, she's actually averaging more points per game than Anastasia Kosu did in her lead up to the draft. However, I will say Anastasia Kosu was definitely more the W caliber athlete and definitely a better defender than Savakova. But we're talking about a 5'10" point guard that can really score off the pick and roll, can knock down the three ball, and can definitely get downhill using it.
It's interesting because normally when we talk about women's basketball in Russia, my mind goes to obviously like the yesteryear of the W greats going over there. But then when I think about like Russian national players, while you were talking about her, I was like, the names that like I think of are all bigs or maybe like a smaller wing. But like, I really don't think of guard play in Russian National League outside of WNBA players going over there and kind of orchestrating them. So I really like that. That's interesting for me to get my eyes onto. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be paying attention to this young one. Who else do we got?
Sure. So we're actually going to go to China for our next two. So we're going to start with Kedjiran or Ron Kedjiev. Definitely a bigger guard at 5'11". I would say a little under 6 feet. Represents China on the U19 level. And I think the U19 World Cup was a great chance for her to really explode onto just the international scene and get some more eyes on her. Averaged 11 rebounds per game in that tournament as a guard, which is, phenomenal. Averaged around 18, 19 points, 11 rebounds at that 5'11" spot. Definitely has one of the more fluid jump shots I've seen from a young player in terms of just the mechanics. Has shown flashes to be a possible creator. The only issue for her is she hasn't gotten a chance to really replicate that level of volume and minutes at the pro level, the WCBA, playing with Sichuan that also has players like Natasha Howard. They recently added Liz Cambage. She had Kalia Hillsman. She just hasn't gotten enough minutes really at the WCBA level to get a very good gauge on, is this a WNBA caliber player? She has shown the flashes, but just the minutes are very, very low and sporadic. So, and the Chinese domestic league, some may look at it as not as strong as maybe a European league. But I think when you look at the flashes of what she's done, plus what she's done in the U19 World Cup, it's definitely a player to keep your eyes on.
Most definitely. Now, I know you said we have another one over there, but I just wanted to make note of, so often, especially with the leagues that, it goes in ebbs and flows, right? The Chinese National League often back in the day, I mean, they had Maya Moore, they had Candace Parker played there. They had some great WNBA legends who played there. And yes, over the most recent years, you have fewer or less, you still have a few. But I think it's important to remember that in the same way that Australia plays a different style of basketball, that France plays a different style of basketball, all these different leagues, they play a very unique style of basketball. And I think, sometimes, yes, this is not the WNBA, but these different style of basketball, you can take players who excel at that in a specific way and implant them into the W, and they can have success. We've seen that time and time again. So I don't want people to sleep on some of these leagues just because, we don't hear about it. It's not, ECAT, or it's not, Fenner, or it doesn't have Valencia, whatever it is. There's still really talented players. And just because they play a different style of basketball doesn't mean, like, the W has changed so much today than it was 5 years ago in terms of style and play and what the coaches are looking for. Just think about it 5 years from now.
Exactly. And I will say for the WCBA, there have been, I think, to me, a notable increase in W players that are over there this season. So you look at names, you have Natasha Howard over there, Tiffany Mitchell, Shatori Walker Kimbrough's over there, Maisha Hines Allen, just so many names, Kennedy Carter's, who's been over there for the past few years. So you still have a good, decent amount of names. I think really it's just that the style of play, but more so on the domestic non-WNBA player level is where you really want to see the biggest developments moving forward. But moving forward to the next name is Yukion Lee. She actually was part of the U19 team that Kejiran played for last year during the summer. Now, she actually has an interesting case because she's like the opposite of Kejiran in the sense where, whereas Kejiran doesn't get the minutes but is playing for a pretty decent team, Yukion Lee is actually getting a ton of minutes but probably plays on the worst team in the league. And I think the interesting balance with that is she's actually gotten more minutes and more film to really see how she fares up against, the possible WNBA players that she may see in those games and just the domestic talent. And I think she's actually shown some pretty interesting things. She's shown some ability to create off the dribble, a little bit of shooting, a little bit of defense, very much of like a do-it-all kind of 6-foot wing type of player, but definitely would be someone to develop over the next coming years. But I think she's shown some potential and she's shown some promise. But again, like with many of these names, these are really more of these long shot, take a chance on, let these players develop.
That's interesting. What league for you is the hardest to follow in terms of timing of games, in terms of, signing up for the website to be able to view, like which league is the hardest? Because I remember a few years ago when I was trying to watch the Chinese league was one of the hardest for me to try and track.
Oh yeah, China is definitely the hardest, just in terms of time and finding the games and really trying to scout and get the platform and everything. Like it really is tough. I mean, China, I think in terms of access, China and Russia are definitely the hardest. But I think in terms of watching and timeline, Australia might just be a little bit just because of the slight time difference. Whereas some of these the Chinese games are on at like 6 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock. So, okay, it's not like too terrible. But with Australia, sometimes you have to be up at 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. or, it can be variable.
Gotcha. All right, who's next on the list?
So we're actually going to go to Australia to close it out. Shout out the WNBL. We're going to start with a name. Her last name might be a little bit familiar if you are an Atlanta Dream fan, but we're going to be talking about Manuela Poch, who is the sister of Nadia Poch, who was drafted in the 2024 draft. So she plays for Southside, which Nadia played for before getting drafted. Part of the U19 World Cup last year. You'll hear me mention U19 World Cup a lot because a lot of the draft prospects that we've talked about, whether it's these drafted stashes or the top names, they played in that World Cup. So it was a good chance to really get a feel for all of these players. But at that 6'1" size, definitely has a big frame, has shown a little bit of floor spacing. She can knock down perimeter shots, but I think really what stands out to me is more of her passing and playmaking, because she really has a feel of being able to just pass, being able to find players, which really stood out to me at the World Cup. And she's shown a little bit of that at the WNBL level. The only problem with her and the next name that I'm going to talk about is really, really low usage. So you really have to scour for those minutes of when they're playing to really see how they're faring on the court, because her usage, it can be 10 minutes, 12 minutes, and she's actually getting some quality production, or it can just be like a 2-3 minute stretch that you see her in. So I think with a lot of these players, you really have to monitor them on a consistent basis and see the low usage games, the high usage games, and really find a way in the middle to get an accurate assessment.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Flyers, the Southside Flyers, they do have a nice little roster of players who have, either played in the W, bounced around the W, at least been to camp. I'm talking Haley Peters, Isabel Bourne, I believe, has, Kayla George, just to name a few. So, like, that's something that I always appreciated. I look back to so many players that have gone to the I always mess up the order of the letters, so I'm just going to say the Australian national